So before the borders were closed, a lot of us had travel plans that we were really excited about that we ended up having to cancel. Like, I had a 2-week trip to Colombia planned with a good friend of mine that I'd been dreaming about doing for years. And even before non-essential travel was banned, we decided to cancel it because the virus was spreading to more places and we figured we'd postpone it for a few months. But we didn't realize at the time that things weren't going to be that simple and that we wouldn't be able to take a trip like this for a long time. And I'm sure a lot of you can relate. A lot of us are itching to leave as soon as we physically can, but it's starting to look like traveling is going to be completely different from what we're used to. This could be one of the aspects of life that gets transformed and where we start to see a new normal. If we have to live with this virus, airlines, cruise lines, hotels, and countries that rely on tourism are going to have to figure out not only how to prevent infection, but also how to make people feel safe about traveling again. Global News' Washington Bureau Chief Jackson Proskow is on the show today. He's been looking into all of the changes that we could see and whether the era of peak travel is over. I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to Wait, There's More. Hey, Jackson.
Hey, Tamara.
I'm really excited for this conversation because I'm very anxious to travel as soon as I can. I have a lot of questions about this. So can we start with what has happened to the travel industry since the start of the pandemic? Can you talk a bit about how it's been impacted?
Yeah, I mean, it has been, for lack of a better word, a complete implosion. I mean, every single sector of the travel industry has suffered tremendously. The airlines have seen air traffic drop off by about 95%. The cruise ships are all stuck in port. They're not even allowed to sail. Hotels are sitting empty, and, theme parks are shut down too. And there was some speculation that Disney might be closed until as early as 2021. Some of the parks are starting to open up again, but it's going to be very slow and very different when it does reopen.
Right. Wow. I saw this one global estimate, I think it was from the UN Tourism Organization, that about 100 million travel sector jobs are gone or will be gone.
Calling it a difficult but necessary business move, Air Canada has announced mass layoffs in light of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it makes up something like 1 in 10 jobs and is responsible for trillions in global GDP. And I was speaking to the World Travel and Tourism Organization, and they basically said it's a domino effect. So you can't lose air travel and then not expect everything down the line to suffer as a result. The hotels, the cruises that people would go on, the restaurants people would go to, the rental cars, the taxi drivers, it's all impacted.
Right, of course. So there's an Air Canada executive who said at an industry event recently that he's expecting to see flying bounce back by around Christmas time.
Cancun is ready to open. They're urging the airlines to start flights. And Air Canada is suggesting that they'll be flying to most destinations by Christmas time. So there's some promises, there's some hope there.
Is that realistic? What have you heard about this? And when do you think people will want to start traveling again, even when we're allowed to?
I mean, I think that's the optimistic scenario, but there are so many variables here. I mean, if we do see a second wave of coronavirus, it's going to be starting in the fall, and that leads right into Christmas time. There's the immediate problem of the fact that for international travel, the borders are effectively closed, and in places where the borders are still open, you face mandatory quarantine on arrival of 14 days. I mean, who's going to spend 2 of their weeks of vacation flying somewhere to have to sit in isolation before they can actually get out and see anything? That's just not realistic. So those things really have to change before people start traveling again. And there's also the sort of public comfort aspect of it, I think. As anxious as people are to travel right now, I don't know anyone who's chomping at the bit to get on an airplane at this moment. And I think there's an expectation that things are going to have to change dramatically before anybody's ready to do that.
And I know you talked to elderly passengers who were on the Grand Princess cruise ship, the one that had that massive outbreak of the coronavirus, and they must have been traumatized. What did they tell you about whether they're going to travel again?
Yeah, I talked to a couple in their 80s, Bob and Dorothy Grubb from British Columbia, and they were stuck on board the Grand Princess.
Finally, a plan to get off the Grand Princess.
It feels bloody wonderful is how it feels.
Daughter Melissa Fitzgerald has spent the past few days working every angle to find a path home for her parents. who've told her they've been confined to their room as meals and general conditions on the ship have deteriorated.
You know, they'd been on 15 cruises before that one. They say that the whole experience, though, really left them with a bad taste in their mouth. And they sort of said that, you know, at their age and stage in life, there's no way they'd be getting on a plane or a cruise ship until there's a vaccine and some sort of guarantee that people aren't going to get sick en masse. They said the sort of most surreal thing on the boat was that the servers and the waiters in the restaurants started not showing up for the meals, and they would find out that they were off sick. And then it became this bigger picture problem of, coronavirus is on board the boat. Test kits were airlifted out by the Coast Guard, and they were stuck on board while the Canadian government and the cruise line figured out how to get them off the boat. It's not the kind of mess that they're anxious to repeat.
Yeah. Okay, so we have this public comfort piece, and then on top of that, there is going to be the economic toll of all the lost jobs and people having less disposable income, right? What are experts saying about that? Like, are people going to have money to travel when it's safe to do it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge part. You know, the unemployment rate is so high right now that obviously that disposable income is a huge question for many people. And of course, the backbone of the travel industry and what sort of led to peak travel up until this was based on the idea of travel anywhere for as cheaply as possible, cram as many bodies onto a plane as possible. That's just not realistic now. So people aren't going to have the money to travel. That's to be certain. A lot of parts of the travel economy as we know it are irreparably damaged. I mean, Airbnbs, for example, are vanishing left and right. That's a huge part of travel. So it's sort of really multifaceted, to use a fancy term for it. It's a disaster for every aspect of the industry.
When we can and when things start to ease up a little bit, where do you think people are going to go first? What kinds of places?
You know, it sounds like this is going to be the year of the road trip, I think, for most people. I think air travel it's not in the foreseeable future, not for months and months and months. So with summer vacation creeping up fast, I think people will stick very close to home, road trips where it's possible. But, you know, there are still interprovincial travel restrictions, for example, in Canada. I know Cottage Country in Ontario has been urging people to stay away, right? They don't want to import the virus into these small towns.
Right.
And it's been the same equation here in the States where, you know, a lot of the sort of areas on Long Island were sort of urging New Yorkers to stay home and not spread the virus there. So I think it will be sort of sticking one toe in the water at a time, and it's going to be a very sort of slow and tepid response to travel this summer. And I kind of wonder how many people are going to make the calculation themselves about, is it safe to travel right now? Do they feel comfortable getting on the road and going somewhere? Do they feel comfortable about what the conditions are going to be like wherever they do go?
Yeah. I've also read about the possibility of countries forming travel bubbles. So New Zealand and Australia, for example, have agreed to create like a travel corridor when it's safe to do it.
One key aspect of our plan to get New Zealand moving is to work on the Trans-Tasman bubble. Both our countries' strong record on fighting the virus has placed us in the enviable position of being able to plan the next stage in our economic rebuild and to include Trans-Tasman travel and engagement in our strategy.
Thailand and Vietnam are talking about it. In Europe, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have announced that they're going to open their internal borders for their citizens starting May 15th. Do you think we could see something like that between Canada and another place?
I definitely don't think it'll be Canada and the U.S. I think there's so much worry about the U.S. response right now, right? Maybe Canada and the U.K., given the bonds there, or select Caribbean countries. But really, I think the calculation in North America is so different because of the number of cases, especially in the U.S.
Right. So we'll have to make a calculation. We'll have to choose our travel corridor partner based on if they have their outbreaks under control and even whether they have stats they can trust. That's another thing that experts have pointed out.
Exactly. And again, I think some countries may even look at Canada with a degree of suspicion or wariness, just given our proximity to the U.S. and given the trajectory that the outbreak has been on in parts of Canada. So I think it's really an open question right now.
You mentioned how there's still so many restrictions in place and we have to quarantine for 2 weeks pretty much everywhere we go. But Thailand is considering opening certain areas to foreign tourists, meaning that visitors are basically quarantined. So like a resort doubles as a quarantine zone. Once things start to ease up a little bit, what do you think things are going to look like once we get to our destinations? How is it going to be different from what it was like before?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is going to be a question of what the local restrictions are like in terms of quarantine, right? And how they handle that. And you're right, maybe there's going to become a market for sort of quarantine resorts, go self-isolate and relax for a while. I think contact tracing is going to be part of the equation for every facet of reopening society. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you go to a different country once that's allowed, that you have to then adopt their contact tracing policies, which could mean for China, for example, it's all based on a phone app so that they can display your status and track where you've been. And other countries are developing their own procedures. That could well be part of it, that you have to register where you've been and where you've going. And then I think there's just going to have to be a sort of degree of flexibility for travelers, that they may have to adjust their plans on a moment's notice if it seems like there are local flare-ups, or they have to be prepared to potentially be stuck somewhere if things flare up in their location and their home government says, you know what, you have to wait it out now. I think those are all going to be part of the equation.
Yeah, and it also, like in terms of flexibility, if local governments are mandating quarantine, that probably means that we're going to have to take longer vacations, right? Like if I have to quarantine for 2 weeks somewhere when I get there and then quarantine for 2 weeks again when I come back, you can't really take a quick trip somewhere anymore.
Exactly. You know, one suggestion I've seen float around is this idea that since technology is at our disposal and since we've proven the concept that you don't need to go into the office anymore, that maybe people will start to take working vacations and they'll say, I'm going to go somewhere for 2 months knowing that they can quarantine, then they can be somewhere for a few weeks and enjoy it, and then maybe do some work while they're there so they're not burning off all their vacation time at once, and then come home and quarantine again but be able to work from home while they're doing it. That is a possibility that could maybe be opened up.
That would be pretty awesome.
I mean, I'd be okay with that.
We'll be right back. The airline industry is going through what looks like kind of an existential crisis right now. There's a lot of research and innovation happening on how to get people flying safely again. And I want to know what you've heard about the future of air travel and what it's going to look like. So can we start with airports? How will things look different once you get to an airport?
So I think much like the grocery store, you're going to see a plexiglass screen separating you from the check-in agent. I think you'll notice stepped up cleaning for sure in terms of any commonly touched surface like the kiosks, the washrooms, all that will be cleaned excessively. And again, the idea of sort of a temperature or health check, whether that's done through a scanner or whether that's done by somebody in person, I think that'll just come to be part of the process. So that's for sure what you'll see when you walk through the door of an airport. I'm really curious, and I think this is an open question right now, but you know, airports sort of turn themselves into malls, right? They make big money on retail and restaurants, and it's not clear how those things survive or adapt going forward. I think luggage is also a big question. How they handle luggage is going to be a piece of the puzzle they have to figure out here. Do they decontaminate or wipe down every bag? Potentially, do they ban people from bringing carry-on onto the plane because those bags could spread germs throughout the aircraft and they can't be controlled and wiped down? Those are the open questions that still have to be figured out.
So I've also heard a couple of other things being floated. So experts are saying that airports might be expanded vertically maybe to create more space and to sort of prevent long queues from being formed around security checks and around baggage claims and things like that. And then there's also ideas being floated that would basically let people go through the entire process of checking in and boarding a flight without coming into contact with other people as much as possible. So parking garages being used to check passengers in. So basically you'd get there, your cell phone would let the airport know that you're there, you get checked in curbside, then you're moved into like a security line where you're also screened by health authorities. Yeah,
the funny thing is that in a lot of ways, the airlines were moving in this direction already, just by virtue of trying to cut costs and use technology. A lot of airports, you know, flying out of Pearson, you check in your bag yourself through a kiosk, you tag it yourself, and you put it on a conveyor belt yourself, and it's scanned and checked without you dealing with a single person. So some of those things are already in progress, and I think it'll be curious to see how they're adapted now to our new reality.
What about once you actually board a plane? So right now, airlines are leaving middle seats open, which doesn't seem sustainable. Like you mentioned, this whole business model is kind of based on cramming as many people together as possible into this small space. So how are things going to change on airplanes?
You know, the middle seat thing is already slipping, and seeing more and more complaints about flights where every seat is taken right now.
For the full 4-hour flight, Dick said passengers were seated side by side with strangers.
In no way, shape, or form were you even close to 6 feet distancing, which I understand. Like a plane, you can't do it. But at least make an effort.
Almost every airline is requiring passengers to wear masks now, and that may end up becoming a government mandate as well. So I think those two things are here to stay in the short term. I think you'll see less service. So the drink cart is probably going away. You'll probably just be handed something that's pre-packaged if you're given anything at all. I don't think they want to encourage people to take their masks off. And I think, if you're at the front of the plane in first class, you might get a bit of service, but still not what it once was. And you'll see the crew in gloves and masks as well. Very curious to see if we get to a point where in-flight cleaning is stepped up as well. Do they try and disinfect the lavatory, for example, between every passenger? I know Boeing is developing some technology to make the washrooms self-cleaning on board, again with UV light. That's the kind of thing that could be rolled out. There's a company called Germ Falcon that has developed a thing, and it's the size of the drink cart that they push down the aisle, and it has these sort of accordion arms that stick out over the seats. And in between flights, they can push it down the aisle, and out of those accordion arms is high-powered UV light. And so they bombard the whole cabin, every seat that the light can reach, with UV light. And in about 3 minutes, they can disinfect an entire airplane cabin.
The same exact UVC lights that they use in hospitals. They attack the DNA and the RNA of a cell and render them inactive. And once these germs are dead, they can no longer infect the next person.
I think it's really going to come down to reassuring people that they're as safe as possible while they're on that plane for as long as they are.
What about pricing? Could travel become cheaper, or is it going to become more expensive? What do you know about that?
Everyone I've talked to suggests in the long term it's probably going to be more expensive for a few reasons. One is if they do have to keep middle seats open, obviously that drives up the cost.
If you start to limit how many people they can put on a plane, that unravels the whole fabric of how they have built a financial model. But if there's social distancing on the plane, I think that leads to higher fares.
The second is that there are fewer planes in the sky, and we're seeing big airlines like Air Canada ground permanently big sections of their fleet. Air Canada has parked 80 aircraft, and they're sending them to the scrapyard. Those planes aren't coming back. So you'll have fewer planes flying fewer routes with less frequency. That's generally a formula for higher prices.
Yeah, and then all this extra labor to clean the planes in between flights is going to add to the cost as well, right?
Exactly. There's already on airfare in the U.S. a 9/11 security tax of a few dollars, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that added, or a bag cleaning tax, or some sort of way to pick up these costs. I mean, the airlines are experts at making you pay for everything.
Okay, let's move on to cruises really quickly. Are they going to be around after this?
Well, the biggest cruise lines are accepting bookings starting this August. I don't know who's going on those cruises or who's booking them. I'm sure they'll try and lure people back with cheap deals. My assumption at the outset here would have been that the cruise industry would have the hardest time clawing its way back. And every expert I've spoken to actually suggests it's the opposite, that they were already taking infection control very seriously on board because they had sort of developed this bad reputation surrounding outbreaks of gastrointestinal illness like Norwalk virus. And so they know how to adapt quickly when there's outbreaks on board. They know how to isolate people. I think the changes when boats do return to the sea will be maybe more limits on how many people can congregate in, the dining areas at a specific time. Cruise lines and hotels, it's probably the end of the buffet. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's probably the end. They don't want everybody touching those utensils.
Right.
My mom actually, just before all this happened in February, had been on a cruise, and they had an outbreak of norovirus. And she said within a day they flipped, and the buffet changed to them having servers serve people at the buffet. So that's an easy adaptation they already know how to do on board the boats. And then it's really just going to be about winning back passengers.
One of their big strategies leading into and throughout the tourism season will be highlighting their enhanced cleaning protocols so that tourists feel comfortable and safe when they return.
Hand sanitizers in the line that between every cruise or before every cruise, we're going to be spraying down all the surfaces, wiping down all the surfaces. All of our staff are going to be fully trained in hand sanitation techniques.
For the vast majority of people, you have to fly to get to your cruise. It's a two-step process. So it's all about sort of restoring traveler confidence, I think.
There are so many cheap deals out there right now. Everything seems to be on sale. Is it a good idea to be booking trips? What are people saying about that?
So the biggest hang up I've heard, or the biggest sort of note of caution, is that if you book something, can you guarantee that the business you're booking with is either going to give you your money back if you have to cancel or if circumstances change? Or if they're only going to give you a credit, will that business survive to be able to give you your money back? And the CEO of Boeing has actually just come out here and said that he expects at least one of the major airlines in the US, and there's only 3 big carriers right now, he expects at least one of them to go bankrupt. So if you're booking with one of those airlines, seeing great fare for a year from now, can you guarantee that that airline is still going to be around, that you'd get your money back? I don't know the answer to that.
And last question, Jackson. There are people who are saying this is an opportunity for a reset in terms of the way that we think about travel. So we can kind of sit with it and think about the effects of over-tourism on local cultures and the environment. We can sort of change the way that tourism works so that it offers more benefit to the places that you're visiting, to those communities and to local businesses. And there's some people who are predicting that travel is just going to become slower and more thoughtful. And do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think this will make people think differently about traveling?
Yeah, one of the people I spoke to is a travel blogger who, racks up millions and millions of points. And that was his exact prediction that, people will stay closer to home. They'll be more purposeful in their travel. It won't just be going somewhere to get the latest shots for your Instagram feed. It'll actually be a meaningful trip that's grounded in a real desire to go there. And you're right. I think this could be a good thing for sites that were suffering like Machu Picchu and Tulum, where over-tourism was a massive problem. It gives those places a chance to reset and recover and think about how they want to develop their tourist economies going forward. At the same time, though, this collapse of the entire travel industry, I've been warned, is actually really disproportionately affecting people in developing countries and developing regions, because the way they've been growing their economy is through tourism. That income has entirely dried up. And so there will be a temptation in many of those areas, for sure, to bring people back as fast as possible and in the biggest numbers possible. I don't know how long this lasts or if this lasts. These places get a breather. I think it's really going to be about the ease and availability of travel more than the desire of these places to welcome tourists back.
Okay, Jackson, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right, that's the show. Thanks so much for listening. And if you like this episode, please rate us, leave us a review, and tell your friends. We really appreciate it. I'm Tamara Kandaker, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.